Amazon's pretty notorious for splurging big bucks on anti-union consultants, basically to crush any effort by their employees to form unions. Now, last year, they spent a colossal $14 million on such consultants. And Vice News investigated that massive sum, and they found receipts that expose one of the company's biggest double standards and hypocrisies. So before we get to that though, it is important to kind of understand how much Amazon is spending on these consultants, especially relative to previous years and relative to other companies who also spend money on such consultants. So according to Dave Jamieson on HuffPost, companies rarely spend more than $1 million on anti-union consultants per year. But in 2021, Amazon spent $4.3 million on anti-union consultants, which by the way is already a huge increase from the norm. However, last year, they put that spending on overdrive, having spent $14.3 million on these consultants. So that's even crazier. But Amazon is just one cog in that massive machine. According to the Economic Policy Institute, employers in America overall have spent over $430 million a year on anti-union consultants. And Amazon, by the way, is required, like all other companies, to report its anti-union spending to the government every year. And that's how Vice was able to review this information and do some reporting on this. So here's where Amazon was caught in a lie, okay? Because remember, Amazon contracts delivery drivers. So there are third parties, companies that have the delivery drivers, and they will contract with those third parties in order to increase the number of delivery drivers, under their umbrella. Now, of the more than $14.2 million that Amazon spent on anti-union consulting in 2022, about $160,595 went to Optimal Employee Relations and Action Resources, who on their own report specifically referred to drivers as their target group of their persuasion, their anti-union, persuasion. And so that's relevant because of this ongoing battle that's happening between the third-party delivery drivers and Amazon. So the delivery drivers want to unionize. Amazon doesn't want to honor any of the collective bargaining that takes place with these third-party drivers. Amazon's massive fleet of delivery drivers are contracted through the third parties. Amazon has insisted that it's very hands-off with how these employers treat their drivers, right? Because they're like, we don't employ them. They're third party, they've got their own boss. However, some of the drivers have alleged that Amazon does in fact dictate all of their working conditions. And so here's how the Teamsters have put it in their complaint to the National Labor Relations Board, quote, Amazon creates the routes, sets delivery targets and goals, directly oversees and monitors the performance of the Amazon drivers working through the delivery service partners, directly mandates certain minimum terms and conditions of employment for their employees who are ostensibly hired through the DSP, unilaterally decides to terminate employees, sets rules the DSP employees must follow, and indirectly controls other terms and conditions of employment by, for example, controlling the compensation received by those DSPs. So this allegation that Amazon is not the employer and has no say over their working conditions is nonsense, absolute nonsense.
Yeah, so there's three things that are, in my opinion, a little bit tough for Amazon here. So number one is what Anna said. Well, if they're not your employees, why are you doing union busting on them? Like if they're really independent contractors, you got nothing to do with it. Why would anybody spend their own money on someone else's union issue, even if you thought it was an issue? That doesn't make any sense. So they betrayed themselves here a little bit, and I think they are busting on it. Look, there's the common sense. What are they delivering? Amazon packages. What does it say on the van? Amazon.
Yep.
What did you order through? Amazon. So it's not that there is no reason for contractors ever. No, there are plenty of situations where a contractor makes more sense than an employee. The question is this one of them? And it doesn't look like it. They look like full-time employees working for Amazon. And Amazon's treating them in a lot of ways like full-time employees working for Amazon. And then the final part of it is what happened in Palmdale. So in Palmdale, one of these outlets did unionize, right? Amazon canceled the contract the next day.
Right.
So they're all fired, they're gone, okay? Gee, I wonder if they're independent contractors. So when they decide to unionize and you fire everyone, because, oh, I canceled the contract, it sounds like they're your employees. And so this is an obvious trick. And the only question that remains is whether a judge at some point is going to say you're not allowed to do this and you are responsible. And that's not at all certain, because a lot of the judges these days are picked by business interests.
Now, the majority of the American public is completely unaware of these labor strikes that have been happening in the country over the last few years. And that's partly because of the fact that legacy media outlets, corporate media outlets have not been doing proper coverage of these strikes and of these labor movements. So Axios actually did a report indicating that during the first 6 months of 2023, about 119,000 workers went on strike. That's actually an increase of nearly 80% from the same period last year. And that number doesn't even count the SAG-AFTRA workers. They went on strike in the beginning of July. Now, how has corporate media covered these strikes? Well, for the most part, they haven't. According to Media Matters, in the first 6 months of 2023, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News covered only 5 of the largest 21 strikes in the country for a total of 5 hours and 49 minutes, ignoring more than a dozen others involving nurses, teachers, industrial workers. But when the SAG-AFTRA strike started in July, cable news covered it for almost 4.5 hours in the first 8 days. So there was a lot more attention paid to the strikes in Hollywood as opposed to the strikes that ordinary rank and file workers in various professions had been engaging in. I remember there was a coal strike that took place for months and it got no media coverage. We ended up covering it here at TYT. There's also issues with how these networks cover the strikes when they do. So for instance, Fox News cited workers in just 18% of segments on the strikes. MSNBC and CNN both cited workers in roughly 60% of their strike segments. Union busting efforts were mentioned in only 1% of CNN's strike segments, despite an uptick in unfair labor practices, charge filings. Fox News and MSNBC did not mention union busting at all in strike coverage during the studied period. So look, I oftentimes get on your case, Cenk, because I don't want you to be surprised when corporate media does what corporate media is supposed to do. Corporate media represents corporate interests. Okay, they're part of these major conglomerates, and these major conglomerates look after corporate interests. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they bury these stories as much as they can. And when they do cover these stories, they do so in such a way, they frame the stories in such a way to almost put the blame on the striking workers because of all the negative impacts that the rest of us are gonna suffer as a result of them standing up for better working conditions, better treatment, and better pay, right? Oh, if they go on strike, it's gonna hurt supply chains and this and that. It's kind of the point. That's where the workers actually have some leverage.
Yeah, I think the difference in between you and me in that regard is that I'm a little bit older, so you know a lot of people who grow up online, and they all know corporate media is douchebaggery and represent corporate interests.
Definitely, yeah.
But in my generation, almost no one knows that. I'm sorry, but it's true. Like, there's a lot of really good people, really smart people. If you told them that CNN, MSNBC are just corporate propaganda, they'd be like, that sounds conspiratorial.
No, that's
crazy.
True. You're right about that. That's definitely true.
Yeah, and yeah, for sure. They have no idea that they're honestly the victims of propaganda. And if you told them that, they would be totally outraged. And so, anyways, in this particular case, Fox News, even when talking about the SAG-AFTRA strike, 66% of the time, 2/3 of the time, mentioned corporate interests instead of the workers' interests, right? And so that's not surprising to anybody, right? But what's interesting is that even as Anna read you those numbers, you can see in the numbers, even CNN and MSNBC never talk about union busting, and especially in the case of the railway strike, almost always framed it as the workers are causing a problem with the economy. The workers are causing a problem that could cause billions or even trillions of dollars in the case of the railways, right? They never frame it as the companies are causing a problem by underpaying or not giving sick days, etc. So, and that's where, now this is something that unfortunately not nearly enough people know overall, which is that corporate media isn't just CNN, New York Times, etc. It's mainstream media plus right-wing media. That's all of corporate media. That is why you're seeing the numbers that you see here. Whenever it's cultural war issues, and this is a point that Anna makes all the time, constant fighting between Fox, MSNBC, and CNN. But when it's economic issues, look at how they close ranks. All of a sudden, corporate media, including right-wing media, is in favor of corporations and never the workers. So that's the situation you have, whether it's Amazon, the Hollywood strike, or any other strike in this country. Always corporate media supports corporate interests first. And so do corporate politicians, both in the Republican and Democratic parties. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.